5 years had passed since the death of Duchess Eleanor Ravensheir, yet grief still lingered inside Ravensheir Manor like a winter that refused to surrender to spring. The great estate stood upon rolling green hills beneath the grey skies of northern England, magnificent in stone and stature, but hollow in spirit. Tall windows overlooked gardens that once hosted laughter, music, and celebrations, yet now seemed to watch the world in silence. Chandeliers still glittered in the grand halls, fireplaces still burned in marble hearths, and servants still carried out their duties with practiced precision, but something essential had vanished from the manor. The heart of the house had died with its duchess. Duke Sebastian Ravensheir often noticed the silence most during supper. At 38, he remained a respected nobleman, admired throughout the kingdom for his intelligence, discipline, and unwavering dedication to his lands. He managed vast estates, settled disputes among tenants, expanded trade agreements, and maintained the honor of his family name. Every hour of every day seemed occupied by responsibility. Yet despite everything he accomplished, he could not repair the brokenness inside his own home. The dining room revealed that failure every evening. The long mahogany table had been designed for lively gatherings, but now it felt absurdly large. For children occupied only a small portion of its length, each trapped within private grief they rarely spoke about. Oliver Ravensheir, 13 years old, carried himself with a seriousness that belonged to a grown man rather than a boy. He spoke little and watched everything. Since his mother's death, he had quietly assumed burdens no child should bear, constantly worrying about his younger siblings while neglecting his own happiness. 11-year-old Theodore preferred books to conversation. He disappeared into stories because real life offered little comfort. He rarely laughed and often seemed startled whenever anyone addressed him directly. 8-year-old Henry possessed enough energy for 3 boys, yet loneliness had transformed his mischief into frustration. He frequently acted out simply to gain attention, though the attention he received usually arrived in the form of reprimands. Rose, only 6, remembered almost nothing about her mother except fragments of warmth and perfume. She often stared at other noble women with quiet curiosity, as though searching for something she could not name. The emptiness in her young eyes troubled Sebastian more than he wished to admit. Night after night, meals arrived untouched. One cook had prepared elaborate feasts. Another had attempted simple comfort food. A third had followed every recommendation offered by physicians and child specialists. Nothing changed. The children picked at their plates and asked to leave early. Some evenings they barely spoke at all. The cooks eventually departed, frustrated and defeated. The governesses followed. The servants whispered that Ravensheir Manor had become cursed by sorrow. Sebastian dismissed such talk whenever it reached his ears, but privately he feared they were not entirely wrong. One rainy evening he sat alone in his study while thunder rolled beyond the windows. Estate ledgers covered his desk. Letters requiring signatures waited beside stacks of reports. A decade earlier he would have completed the work efficiently. Now he found himself staring at the same page for nearly 10 minutes. His thoughts drifted toward the dining room. Were the children eating? Had Rose finished her vegetables? Had Henry caused trouble again? He knew remarkably little about the daily lives of his own children. The realization struck him with uncomfortable force. Grief had not only taken his wife, it had slowly stolen pieces of his family. The following week, his head housekeeper approached him with news of another applicant for the vacant cook's position. Sebastian nearly refused the suggestion. The previous failures had exhausted his patience. Yet practical necessity forced him to agree. The children needed meals. The household needed stability. At the very least, another cook might last longer than the last one. Arabella Hawthorne arrived 2 days later. She stepped from a modest carriage carrying a single worn suitcase and a smile that seemed oddly untouched by hardship. At 26, she possessed neither the confidence of aristocracy nor the nervousness of someone intimidated by a great estate. Her expression held a quiet warmth that immediately distinguished her from every applicant who had come before. Several servants exchanged skeptical glances. She appeared far too cheerful for Ravensheir Manor. Arabella greeted each servant by name after hearing it only once. She thanked stable boys, complimented gardeners, and somehow convinced a notoriously grumpy kitchen maid to laugh before lunchtime. Sebastian observed the commotion from a distance. He found it mildly amusing. Nothing more. That evening Arabella prepared her first meal. The Duke expected another disappointing supper. Instead, something unusual happened. As darkness settled beyond the windows, faint voices drifted through the manor. Then came another sound. A laugh. A genuine laugh. Sebastian froze. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then another burst of laughter followed. And another. Abandoning his paperwork, He rose from his desk and moved toward the dining room. The closer he came, the clearer the sound became. Theodore was laughing so hard he nearly dropped his spoon. Henry was attempting to tell a story between fits of giggling. Even Oliver's carefully guarded expression had softened. Rose looked brighter than Sebastian had seen in years. At the center of the table stood the new cook, serving food while animatedly describing a disastrous encounter with a runaway goat during her travels through a distant village. The children hung on every word. Sebastian remained unseen in the doorway. For several silent moments he simply watched. The sound filling the room felt unfamiliar and precious, like music remembered after years of silence. And as Arabella smiled at his children, drawing laughter from hearts that grief had locked away, a strange thought settled into the Duke's mind. Perhaps he had not hired an ordinary cook after all. The change began so gradually that few people inside Ravensshire Manor noticed it at first. A week after Arabella Hawthorne's arrival, the dining room no longer felt like a place of obligation. Meals became something the children anticipated rather than endured. Empty plates started returning to the kitchen. Conversations stretched beyond a few reluctant sentences. Even the servants found themselves lingering nearby simply to hear the laughter that had become increasingly common. Arabella never forced affection. She earned it. She paid attention to details others overlooked. When Oliver absent-mindedly mentioned that shepherd's pie had once been his favorite meal, she served it 3 days later. She remembered Theodore's fondness for honey cakes after hearing him speak of them only once. Henry's delight in roasted apples became a regular surprise after afternoons spent outdoors. Rose received cinnamon pudding served in delicate bowls decorated with tiny flowers because Arabella knew the little girl loved beautiful things. The children were astonished. Most adults spoke to them. Arabella listened. That simple difference changed everything. Before long, the kitchen became more crowded than the drawing rooms. Every afternoon the 4 children found excuses to visit. Oliver claimed he wanted to observe how meals were organized. Theodore insisted he enjoyed reading beside the warmth of the ovens. Henry openly admitted he came because the kitchen smelled wonderful. Rose rarely bothered inventing explanations at all. She simply appeared. Flour dust often coated their sleeves by evening. They learned how to knead bread with steady hands. They decorated cakes with varying degrees of success. They peeled vegetables, stirred sauces, and occasionally sampled ingredients when Arabella pretended not to notice. The vast kitchen, once occupied only by servants, slowly transformed into the happiest room in Ravensshire Manor. For the first time in years, the castle possessed a heartbeat. Sebastian witnessed the transformation from a distance. Some evenings he paused outside the kitchen doorway while returning from estate meetings. The sight always surprised him. His children seemed lighter. Oliver no longer carried the weight of adulthood on every expression. Theodore contributed to conversations without being prompted. Henry's mischief had become playful rather than desperate. Rose smiled so frequently that it was difficult to remember the solemn little girl she had once been. The Duke found himself watching Arabella more carefully than before. She moved through the room with effortless kindness. Not dramatic kindness. Not attention-seeking kindness. The quiet kind that revealed itself through actions. She remembered birthdays. She noticed disappointments. She celebrated small victories. She treated every child as though their thoughts mattered. Sebastian increasingly realized how rare such qualities truly were. Then the storm arrived. Dark clouds gathered above the estate one afternoon and swallowed the sky. Wind bent the trees along the hillsides. Rain hammered the manor's windows with relentless force. The servants hurried to secure shutters and livestock. The mill stream that crossed part of the estate quickly swelled beneath the downpour. By evening, water rushed through the valley with frightening speed. Inside the manor, everyone remained occupied by the worsening weather. Everyone except Henry. The boy had slipped away unnoticed. Adventure called to him whenever rules attempted to hold him still. Wrapped in a coat far too thin for the conditions, he wandered toward the stream. The rain soaked him within minutes. The old wooden bridge spanning the water had stood for decades. Normally it presented little danger. That evening the swollen current crashed violently beneath its supports. Henry hesitated. Then curiosity overcame caution. He stepped onto the bridge. The first few boards held. The next did not. A terrible crack split through the storm. The rotten timber collapsed beneath his feet. One moment he stood above the water. The next he disappeared into it. The current seized him instantly. Freezing water dragged him downstream. Henry surfaced long enough to scream before another wave swallowed the sound. Across the meadow, Arabella heard it. She had been returning from a nearby storage shed when the cry pierced the storm. She looked toward the stream. For one dreadful second she saw a small hand vanish beneath the rushing water. Without stopping to think, she ran. Rain lashed her face. Mud slid beneath her boots. The distance seemed endless. Henry surfaced again farther downstream. Arabella reached the riverbank and threw herself into the torrent. The cold struck like a physical blow. The current immediately tried to pull her under. Water filled her ears. The world became chaos. Yet she kept moving. Henry appeared only a few feet ahead. Then vanished. Then appeared again. Arabella fought forward. The river slammed her against submerged branches. Pain shot through her shoulder. Still she pushed onward. Finally her fingers closed around the back of Henry's coat. Relief lasted only an instant. The current fought to reclaim them both. Arabella wrapped one arm around the terrified boy and struggled toward shore. Every movement felt impossible. Every breath burned. Yet somehow she continued. By the time estate workers spotted them, she had nearly exhausted all strength. Shouts echoed through the rain. Ropes were thrown. Men rushed into the water. Moments later both were dragged onto solid ground. Henry coughed violently but remained conscious. Arabella did not. When Sebastian arrived, breathless from his frantic ride across the estate, a crowd had already gathered near the riverbank. His gaze immediately found his son. Henry was alive. The relief nearly buckled his knees. Then he saw who lay beside him. Arabella's face was pale. Rainwater clung to dark strands of hair across her cheeks. Her eyes remained closed. Most striking of all was the fact that even unconscious, one hand still gripped Henry's coat as though refusing to let him drift away. Something tightened painfully inside Sebastian's chest. He knelt beside her. For several endless moments he could only stare. This woman had risked everything. Not for recognition. Not for reward. Not because anyone expected it. She had done it because a frightened child needed saving. Henry reached for Arabella's motionless hand and refused to let go. The gesture silenced everyone present. And as the storm finally began to weaken overhead, Sebastian realized a truth that unsettled him more than the near tragedy itself. The children no longer needed Arabella in their lives. They loved her. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, he feared losing someone before he had fully understood what they had come to mean to him. The river accident altered something inside Ravensshire Manor that no one could quite explain. Perhaps it was because danger had revealed truths that ordinary days concealed. Perhaps it was because every member of the household had witnessed what Arabella Hawthorne was willing to sacrifice for a child who carried neither her blood nor her name. Whatever the reason, the walls that had once separated her from the Ravensshire family seemed to dissolve almost overnight. Her recovery lasted only a few days. Henry spent every hour of it at her bedside. Whenever servants attempted to escort him elsewhere, he stubbornly returned. The moment Arabella finally opened her eyes, Henry burst into tears and wrapped his arms around her. "You saved me," he whispered. Arabella brushed damp hair from his forehead and smiled. "You were worth saving." From that day forward, Henry followed her like a shadow. If Arabella baked bread, Henry appeared with flour already covering his sleeves. If she walked through the gardens, Henry carried her basket. If she sat beside the fire in the evening, Henry occupied the nearest chair. No one possessed the heart to separate them. The changes extended beyond Henry. Oliver began seeking Arabella's advice whenever difficult decisions arose among the children. Though only 13, he carried a deep sense of responsibility and often worried about failing his family. One afternoon she found him staring across the estate from a library window. "You cannot carry everyone's burdens alone," she told him gently. "I'm the eldest." "That means you lead," Arabella replied. "It does not mean you suffer in silence." The words lingered with him long after she left. Slowly, Oliver learned that strength and vulnerability could coexist. Theodore's struggles proved different. His fears lived quietly beneath the surface. He feared disappointment. He feared mistakes. He feared becoming invisible. Arabella recognized those anxieties almost immediately. Rather than forcing confidence upon him, she encouraged small acts of courage. A question asked aloud. An opinion shared at dinner. A story read before guests. Each success built upon the last. Week by week, Theodore began stepping beyond the protective walls he had built around himself. Rose needed something simpler. Love. Not grand gestures. Not lessons. Only love. Arabella braided her hair in the mornings. Read stories before bedtime. Listened to endless descriptions of imaginary adventures. Held her hand during walks. Remembered every tiny concern. Rose flourished beneath that attention like a flower finally receiving sunlight. Even Sebastian noticed how much brighter she seemed. The kitchen remained the center of it all. The room smelled constantly of bread, cinnamon, roasting herbs, and laughter. The children spent so much time there that the servants joked it had become a second nursery. One afternoon Rose accidentally revealed the truth. She had been searching for Theodore when she innocently asked a footman whether he had seen him near Mother's room. The servant looked confused. Rose pointed toward the kitchen. Within hours the entire household knew. The children had secretly renamed the room Mother's room. No one mocked the title. No one dared. The words carried too much meaning. The kitchen was not merely where meals were prepared. It was where wounds healed, where fears were soothed, where lonely children remembered what comfort felt like. When Sebastian first heard the name, he stood silently outside the doorway for several moments. Mother's room. The phrase struck deeper than he expected. His children had chosen it without discussion, without planning, without realizing what it revealed. For the first time since Eleanor's death, they associated someone with safety again. And that someone was Arabella. The realization followed Sebastian everywhere. He found himself noticing details he had previously overlooked. The way her eyes softened when listening. The patience she extended even during difficult moments. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself. Her kindness never appeared performative. It emerged naturally, as though generosity formed part of her very nature. The more he observed her, the more difficult it became to remain emotionally distant. One evening he joined the children for supper instead of eating separately in his study. Then he joined them again the following evening. Soon it became habit. Conversations lengthened. Meals felt warmer. The manor felt alive. For years Sebastian had believed grief demanded solitude. Now he wondered whether grief had merely convinced him of a lie. The shift frightened him. Yet it also filled him with unexpected hope. Weeks later a distinguished visitor arrived at Ravensshire Manor. Count Edwin Pembroke had known noble families throughout England for decades and possessed a remarkable memory for faces. During a gathering in the drawing room, his attention settled upon Arabella. The Count froze. His expression changed instantly. Recognition. Disbelief. Then certainty. Arabella saw it too. Color drained from her face. The Count approached slowly. "My lady," he said quietly. The room fell silent. Arabella lowered her eyes. "You mistake me for someone else." "No," the Count replied. "I most certainly do not." Sebastian watched the exchange with growing confusion. The children looked equally bewildered. The Count turned toward the Duke. "Do you truly not know who she is?" Arabella closed her eyes briefly. The gesture carried exhaustion rather than fear. For years she had protected this secret. Now it stood exposed before everyone. At Sebastian's request, the gathering moved to a private sitting room. There, beneath the glow of lamplight, the truth finally emerged. Arabella Hawthorne had not been born a servant. She had been born Lady Arabella Hawthorne, daughter of Earl William Hawthorne. Her family had once possessed wealth, influence, and respect. Then betrayal destroyed everything. Trusted business partners manipulated financial records, fabricated accusations, and shifted blame onto her father. The scandal spread rapidly. Courts believed the lies. Friends disappeared. Investments vanished. The Hawthorne name became synonymous with disgrace. The family lost nearly everything. Years later her parents died in poverty, carrying broken hearts and ruined reputations. Silence filled the room after her confession. The children stared at her. Not with judgment. With sadness. Rose reached across the sofa and took her hand. "You're still you," she said softly. Arabella's eyes filled with tears. Sebastian felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Not pity. Admiration. She could have introduced herself by title. She could have demanded sympathy. Instead she had rebuilt her life through honest labor. "I never wanted anyone to feel sorry for me," Arabella finally said. "I wanted to stand on my own merits." The statement lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. And as Sebastian looked at the woman who had saved his son, healed his children, and carried unimaginable loss with quiet grace, he realized a truth he could no longer deny. He had not merely come to value Arabella Hawthorne. Somewhere between shared meals, children's laughter, and a room called Mother's Room, he had fallen completely in love with her. The realization should have brought peace. Instead, as Arabella stared into the firelight with shadows of old pain still lingering behind her eyes, Sebastian found himself wondering whether a woman who had already lost everything would ever risk her heart again. For a brief period, Ravensshire Manor seemed to exist beneath a rare blessing. The children were happy. The servants smiled more often. The long shadows of grief no longer dominated every corridor. Even Sebastian found himself looking toward the future instead of constantly dwelling upon the past. That fragile peace began to crack the moment Lady Celeste Ashcombe arrived. Her carriage rolled through the manor gates beneath a brilliant autumn sky. The horses wore silver harnesses. Uniformed attendants accompanied her. Every detail announced wealth, status, and confidence. At 32, Lady Celeste possessed striking beauty and impeccable social standing. Her gowns were admired throughout London. Noblemen competed for her attention. Society considered her an ideal match for almost any aristocrat in England, including Duke Sebastian Ravensheir. The assumption followed her everywhere. Many already expected an engagement announcement. Celeste certainly did. She entered Ravensheir Manor carrying herself with the certainty of someone who believed the future had already been decided. Initially, her visit appeared pleasant enough. She charmed guests, praised the estate, spoke politely with the children. Yet beneath the polished exterior, she possessed a keen eye for weaknesses. And she noticed something immediately. The children adored Arabella. Henry abandoned conversations the moment Arabella entered a room. Rose constantly searched for opportunities to sit beside her. Theodore sought her opinion before making decisions. Even Oliver, usually cautious with affection, trusted her completely. More troubling still was Sebastian. Celeste saw the way his gaze lingered, the way his expression softened, the way he seemed most at ease whenever Arabella was nearby. The realization unsettled her. By the second week of her visit, jealousy had already begun to take root. The first attack came disguised as humor. During tea, Celeste glanced toward Arabella and smiled pleasantly. "It is remarkable," she said. "One rarely encounters a cook who spends quite so much time among noble families." The comment seemed harmless. Yet the room grew noticeably quieter. Arabella simply continued pouring tea. Sebastian's expression hardened slightly. Celeste noticed, and understood exactly where to strike next. The remarks became more frequent. Always subtle. Always delivered with perfect manners. A servant's place. Proper boundaries. The dangers of becoming overly familiar with employers. Each comment carried the same hidden message. Arabella did not belong. The children recognized the cruelty before most adults did. Rose stopped smiling whenever Celeste entered a room. Henry openly scowled. Theodore withdrew into uncomfortable silence. Oliver's patience wore thinner with every passing day. Arabella endured everything without complaint. She never defended herself. Never argued. Never retaliated. That quiet dignity only frustrated Celeste further. When private insults failed, she turned toward public humiliation. A dinner gathering brought several neighboring nobles to Ravensheir Manor. Conversation flowed easily until Celeste steered it elsewhere. "I understand Miss Hawthorne has become quite indispensable," she remarked. Several guests looked curious. Celeste laughed softly. Although one wonders whether her talents truly belong in the kitchen. The implication hung heavily over the table. Whispers followed. Speculation spread. By the following week, rumors traveled beyond Ravensheir Manor. Society began talking. Some claimed Arabella intended to marry the Duke. Others insisted she was manipulating the children to secure a future position. The cruelest versions suggested she had deliberately used her tragic past to gain sympathy. None of it was true. Yet truth mattered little once gossip gained momentum. Sebastian fought against it. Whenever rumors reached his ears, he dismissed them immediately. He defended Arabella during conversations, corrected falsehoods, demanded respect. But gossip behaved like wildfire. The harder he tried to extinguish it, the faster it spread. The children suffered most. At a social gathering, Rose overheard two noble women discussing Arabella. Their laughter followed her long after the conversation ended. That evening she cried herself to sleep. Henry reacted differently. His sadness became anger. When another boy repeated a rumor he had heard from adults, Henry nearly started a fight. Only Oliver's intervention prevented disaster. Theodore retreated into books again. Not because he preferred solitude. Because pain felt easier to endure when hidden. Watching their suffering broke Arabella's heart. For weeks she wrestled with impossible questions. If she remained, would the rumors ever stop? Would the children continue facing ridicule because of her? Would Sebastian's reputation suffer permanent damage? Every answer led to the same painful conclusion. She had become the center of a storm. And storms rarely spared innocent people. One evening she stood alone inside the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. The room glowed softly beneath lantern light. Mother's room. The words carved above a shelf caught her attention. Rose had painted tiny flowers around the letters. Henry had proudly contributed uneven hammer marks. Theodore had measured the spacing. Oliver had supervised the entire project. A wave of emotion nearly overwhelmed her. She loved these children. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. Completely. Which was precisely why she knew what she had to do. The decision shattered her. Yet once made, it felt unavoidable. The following afternoon she behaved exactly as she always had. She baked bread, helped with lessons, listened to Theodore read aloud, praised Oliver's progress, played games with Henry, braided Rose's hair. No one suspected anything. That night the manor slept peacefully. Arabella remained awake. A small candle burned beside her bed. Sheets of paper covered the desk. Slowly, carefully she began writing. One letter for Oliver. One for Theodore. One for Henry. One for Rose. Each page contained memories, encouragement, and love. She thanked Oliver for protecting his siblings. Reminded Theodore that courage often appeared quietly. Told Henry his kindness mattered more than his strength. Promised Rose that she would always carry her in her heart. Tears stained several lines before she finished. Near dawn, she folded each letter individually. Outside, the first pale hints of morning touched the horizon. Arabella packed the same worn suitcase she had carried into Ravensshire Manor months earlier. The sight felt painfully symbolic. She had arrived with almost nothing. Now she was leaving behind everything that mattered. Without waking anyone, she carried the suitcase downstairs. The corridors remained silent. The kitchen stood empty. Mother's room. For several moments she simply stood there, remembering laughter, birthday cakes, flower-covered hands. Children gathered around warm ovens. A family she had never expected to find. Then she placed the letters carefully upon the table and walked away. When the front door closed behind her, the sound echoed through the sleeping manor like the end of something precious. And as dawn slowly spread across Ravensshire Manor, the woman who had brought life back into the castle disappeared down the road alone, leaving 4 farewell letters behind and carrying a broken heart that no title, fortune, or future happiness could ever completely mend. Morning arrived at Ravensshire Manor beneath pale autumn sunlight, but no warmth entered the castle. The silence had returned. Not the peaceful silence of dawn. The old silence. The one that had haunted the manor after Duchess Eleanor's death. Servants moved quietly through the corridors. Conversations remained hushed. Even the fireplaces seemed to burn less brightly. The absence of one woman had changed everything. When Rose discovered the letter on the kitchen table, her scream echoed through the manor. Within minutes all 4 children had gathered inside Mother's room. The letters were opened with trembling hands. Oliver read first. His jaw tightened as he reached the final lines. Arabella thanked him for being brave when no child should have been forced to carry such burdens. She told him leadership was not measured by sacrifice alone but by kindness. Most of all, she reminded him that protecting others did not mean forgetting himself. Theodore unfolded his own letter. Arabella wrote of courage. Not the loud courage found on battlefields. The quiet courage required to speak when afraid. To trust others. To believe his voice mattered. By the time he finished reading, tears blurred the words. Henry cried openly. Arabella's letter told him that his greatest strength was not his energy or stubbornness but the enormous heart he carried inside him. She reminded him that heroes were measured by love rather than victories. Rose could barely finish her letter through her tears. Arabella promised that no distance would ever erase the place Rose held within her heart. The little girl pressed the paper against her chest and sobbed. Sebastian arrived moments later. He found his children gathered around the kitchen table. The letters lay before them like pieces of a shattered future. No one needed to explain. The empty chair said everything. The realization struck him with crushing force. Arabella was gone. For several days the manor existed in a state of quiet heartbreak. Meals became mechanical again. The children returned to old habits. Rose barely ate. Henry stopped visiting the gardens. Theodore retreated into books. Oliver attempted to remain strong, but grief shadowed every expression. Sebastian suffered no less. Every corridor reminded him of her. Every room carried memories. Every laugh he heard in recollection became another accusation. He had spent months protecting her from rumors. Yet he had failed to protect her from the damage those rumors caused. The royal autumn gathering approached quickly. It was one of the most important social events of the year. Nobles from across England were expected to attend. Preparations consumed the household. Guests began arriving. Carriages lined the entrance. Musicians prepared in the ballroom. Servants hurried between chambers carrying flowers, silver trays, and final arrangements. Yet inside the Ravensshire family, nothing felt celebratory. The evening of the gathering finally arrived. Guests filled the grand ballroom. Chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors. Elegant gowns shimmered. Crystal glasses sparkled. Every influential family seemed present. Only one problem remained. The 4 Ravensshire heirs were missing. Servants searched every floor. Footmen checked the gardens. Stable hands inspected the grounds. No one could find them. Concern slowly spread through the manor. Sebastian abandoned formal greetings and began searching personally. At last, one elderly maid quietly approached him. "I think I know where they are, Your Grace." Without another word, she led him through silent hallways, down familiar staircases, toward the kitchen. Mother's room. The door stood slightly open. Sebastian pushed it gently. The sight inside stopped him cold. The room remained exactly as Arabella had left it. Rose sat beside the old table, clutching her letter. Tears stained her cheeks. Henry sat nearby holding Arabella's apron against his chest. Theodore carefully turned the pages of her recipe book. Oliver sat at the center of the room with his farewell letter folded in his hands. No one spoke. No one looked toward the ballroom. They looked like children mourning a parent. Sebastian felt his heart fracture. Finally Oliver raised his eyes. "You hired her to cook meals, Father?" The words landed heavily inside the silent room. "But she became our family." No one moved. No one interrupted. Rose wiped her eyes and whispered softly, "Families don't leave people behind." The simplicity of the statement carried more power than any accusation. For years Sebastian had believed responsibility meant preserving reputation, maintaining appearances, protecting status. His children had just revealed a greater truth. None of those things mattered if the people you loved stood alone. He looked around the room, at the apron, the recipe book, the letters, the grief. Then he made a decision. Minutes later he walked into the ballroom. Conversations immediately quieted. Hundreds of eyes followed him. Lady Celeste Ashcombe smiled expectantly. She clearly believed an important announcement was coming. It was. Sebastian stepped forward. "The gathering is cancelled." Shock rippled through the room. Confused whispers followed. "I have more important matters to attend to than society's expectations." Without offering further explanation, he turned and left. The guests remained speechless. For the first time in years, Sebastian chose his children over public approval. The following morning the search began. Weeks passed. Villages were visited. Towns were explored. Questions were asked. The children insisted upon accompanying him. They refused to remain behind. The journey carried them across rolling countryside, bustling marketplaces, fishing harbors, and coastal roads battered by sea winds. Hope faded more than once. Yet none of them surrendered. Then, one chilly afternoon near the coast, Henry spotted a small sign hanging above a modest storefront. Fresh bread. The scent reached them before they entered. Sebastian pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly. Behind the counter stood Arabella. For several seconds nobody moved. She stared at them. The tray she carried nearly slipped from her hands. Then Rose ran forward. The others followed instantly. Laughter and tears collided. Henry nearly knocked over a chair in his haste. Theodore embraced her so tightly she laughed through her crying. Oliver simply held her hand, unable to trust himself to speak. Arabella looked overwhelmed. "How did you find me?" "We never stopped looking," Rose answered. The little girl then placed a flower crown upon Arabella's head. She had made it herself during the journey. Arabella burst into tears. Then Oliver stepped forward. He held a folded document. "Before Father says anything, we have something for you." Confused, Arabella accepted it. Her eyes widened as she read. The document was not a marriage proposal. It was a legal guardianship petition. The children had formally requested that Arabella become their mother. Her hands trembled. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. Then Sebastian slowly knelt before her. The bakery fell silent. His voice carried the sincerity of a man finally speaking from his soul. "Before I ask you to be my wife, I want to ask something more important." Arabella could barely breathe. Sebastian glanced toward the children standing beside him, then back at her. "Will you accept the title you've already earned?" Emotion overwhelmed her completely. "Will you be their mother?" The answer arrived through tears. "Yes." Months later, beneath warm spring sunlight, Ravensheir Manor hosted a wedding unlike any in its history. There were flowers, music, and celebration. Yet the most memorable moment occurred before the ceremony even began. The 4 children proudly stepped forward before every guest. Rose smiled brightly. Henry stood taller than ever. Theodore's confidence finally shone. Oliver's eyes reflected peace. Together they announced the bride's arrival. "This is our mother." Not a single guest remained dry-eyed. Years later, visitors entering the castle kitchen would always notice the wooden sign hanging proudly above the doorway. Mother's room. The family kept it there forever. And whenever laughter echoed through Ravensheir Manor, as it often did, Sebastian would look toward Arabella and remember the extraordinary truth that changed all their lives. He had hired a cook to feed his children. Instead, she had given them back their family.